implementation and implementation of communities that care for the preventive system in 5 countries around the world. So a lot of the faces here are familiar, and I know they know about communities that care, but we'll talk a little bit about it anyway. So the discussants that are here with me represent 5 different countries that I'll show just in a moment, and 4 different continents. And they also represent different affiliations. So we have people from universities, from local governments, from foundations, non-governmental organizations. And they also represent both the academic and the practitioner perspectives. So that's why we think this is going to be really interesting. Let's see, in the world here, I'm going to start introducing who we are. There's John Tumburu getting his...
I'm just leaving.
And he works in Australia in university. We've got Frederick Roth from Germany, and he works in the Crime Prevention Council of Lower Saxony, one of the states in Germany. We've got Birgitta Mansson from Sweden, and she works in the city of Malmö. We've got Maria Luisa Correa, who works at the San Carlos de Maipo Foundation in Chile. And Juliana Mejia, who works at the Nuevos Rumbos Corporation in Colombia. That's kind of like a non-governmental organization that works in the area of prevention and substance use. And then I'm Nicole Eisenberg, and I work at the Social Development Research Group at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I have worked with many of the discussants here in music care over the years, and I currently work mostly with the San Carlos de Maipo Foundation and the Chilean project. So, I know most of you know what community care is. Like, is there anybody here who's familiar with community care? Okay, so I'll give a super brief intro. Community care is a community-wide preventive intervention. We've got David Hawkins here, who is one of the developers of the system. The goal is to promote healthy youth development and prevent problem behaviors such as substance use and delinquent behavior and other problems. And there are, some key elements to the system and how it works. So it works through the development of local community coalitions. So community members gather in a coalition and they lead the prevention work. It requires the assessment of risk and protective factors in the community's use, and then prioritizing of the risk factors that are most prevalent or salient in that community. And then those are targeted with evidence-based programs that match the local need in that community. And we want these to be implemented with fidelity and reach. So, in a nutshell, what this system entails. And it basically works, kind of operates through 5 phases that are cyclical. So the community kind of gets started, engages people to work on this, key leaders, champions within the community, they're gonna work and lead this initiative. Then the coalition is more formalized and organized. Then there's the development of the community profile, which is the assessment of risk and protection and prioritizing the needs and also evaluating what resources already exist in the community. Then there's the creation of a plan, an action plan that the community creates to decide what programs are going to be used to address the most prevalent needs. And then finally there's implementation and there's monitoring and then evaluation, and then it's a cyclical process that continues over time. And needs are assessed continually every couple of years so that there's monitoring what's going on. So the system was developed in the United States to address for American communities, but the system has also been adapted locally for use in several different countries, including the ones that we have here. And in each country, CTC represents an innovation to how prevention had been done in that country before. It's a different approach. And we've been meeting with this group for many years now, and we've had lots of conversations, and we've really realized that what's innovative about CTC really is different in one country versus the other, and we thought we want to share some of those things. So the way that we've structured this is I have 4 guiding questions that I'll be asking, and I'll be asking the discussants to kind of talk about their experiences and the different countries kind of relating to each one of those questions. And we we encourage and want audience participation, so please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions or participate. Okay, so the first question is, which has been the main innovation that the CTC system has contributed to community prevention work in your country? And I think I'm going to ask Marvin first.
Okay. In our case, one of the main innovations is the evidence-based intervention approach. In Chile, there are few preventive interventions. Most of interventions for children and adolescents are mainly focused on treatment. The main budget of the government and of private institutions, it's used in treatment interventions. So one of the main innovation was that we were able that the communities understood and make their own the idea of prevention. And they didn't, they not only they understood that it is effective, but that it is also cost effective, and they were able to make it of their own. They truly understood it, they truly believe it, and they have been able to convince the local governments on the importance of prevention. On the other hand, another innovation could be the role of the community in communities that care. I don't know if in your countries, but at least in Chile, most of interventions have a paternalistic model, where someone from outside comes with an intervention that is supposed to change the community and solve all of their problems. That's not how communities that care works. So the community finally has a role where they can see themselves as actors capable of making changes in their own context, as actors responsible of making changes. And not only that, but they also achieve to be recognized by local governments and by traditional institutions as actors that can make the difference and that it can make changes to reach the healthy development of kids in their context. So I think those two would be the main innovations for us, in our culture, that the Ctc system has brought.
Okay. It's a little bit different in a German situation. So I think it's important to understand that we are working with pre-existing coalitions. So in our state in Lower Saxony, we have at least 200 active community coalitions not working with CTC before. And there's also the idea of preventive, effective programs already there in Germany, and also the idea of working with data. But no one has before bring all these ideas together. And so I think the main innovative thing in Germany is that now coalitions perceive themselves as the ones who are the one that could decide together and collaboratively on which kind of programs are the most appropriate for their community. And in the usual community coalitions in Germany are doing mainly networking. So the stakeholders meet together and they talk about some things and they exchange information, but they do not decide collaboratively on what to do, and do not build consensus about what are the common needs in our community. And usually the community coalitions are the ones who adopt CTC who are not satisfied with this kind of work anymore. So we are often called by people who are even get frustrated by this way of doing community coalitions, because they see themselves that couldn't be effective what we are doing here, and there must be more structured, more logical, more data-based way to find out, and then CTC helps them to get a more broader discussion in their group, in their already existing coalition to work with this instrument.
Yes, I think it's about the same. The innovation for us in Sweden and Malmö is evidence. That is really evidence-based. In Malmö, as I think in many other places, there are so many people that want to participate in the preventive work, and there are so many initiatives going on. but Ctc help us to focus on what's really work. And it also provides all the people, all the members of the coalition in a very good training. It's like bridging the gap between research and practice. And regardless of the coalition members' background and previous studies, Ctc provides high quality knowledge about prevention and principles for implementation. So we learn to ask the questions, does it work? Does this intervention work? How do you know? Why intervene? Is there a need for this? Does this intervention work? And how do we know? And can it hurt?
Us, then everybody's stolen the thunder. All the lines, everything is said. So
We'll switch the order. Don't worry.
Yeah. So in Australia, this is now 20 years of experience we've had. So I have to sort of cast my mind back to where we were when we first heard this. I think the first thing I'm going to say is it gave us optimism that it was possible to prevent, because at that stage there was pessimism that it was possible to prevent, and so we took the message that. When we heard it and we could see convincing model by which we felt we could use this and that we could be able to prevent things, then that created excitement, and it also drew people out of the community that were wanting to prevent, and they became the champions. So it also created a flag that the group could gather under who wanted to get this to happen. And so I think that's been, they were the starting points, and then many of the other things we'll talk about have probably come along during the journey. So certainly that was the start.
Are there any questions able to work on the long-term process and achieve sustainability over time? So I didn't talk about this, but community care is a process that requires a long time. It's not a quick, easy fix intervention. You go in, you do something for a couple of months, you're done. It requires, many years of commitment, and certainly, up to kind of a decade until you start seeing real results in a community and changing outcomes for kids. So sustainability and long-term engagement is a super important element, and I wanted to get your input on how you've worked on this. So I'm going to start with John now.
Thanks. So for us, one of the things we've learned being part of the Communities That Care movement is we do have conversations every year with the different communities, and so we're really learning lessons from one another about how to encourage our nations on the prevention journey. So one of the things I learned when we had our good friend Harry at the table from the Netherlands was the importance of actually having a national approach, and I think that we've seen this in a number of the nations that are doing well with Communities That Care, is to try to bring along prevention scientists to put their stamp of approval on things such as we have now a menu of prevention services. And initially when we started, we were adopting the American menu that was the Communities That Care Prevention Strategies Guide, and we were selling that around the nation. Look, we've got a guide, and it had my name on it because I was the reviewer and bringing all these programs in. And initially that got us through. We had a menu we could use, but now what we do is that it's actually done by the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Young People, and they call it What Works for Kids. So I worked with them to help them set up an online portal, and there's the rating of the evidence there, and then I said, look, here's the deal, I'll do that, but what I want you to do is get the developers to code everything with the Communities That Care risk and protecting factors, so that communities can use the survey. If they're measuring high levels of family conflict in their community, they can click on that, and it will list the 13 programs available in Australia that the developers say can reduce that problem. So that was something, again, that has allowed us to go deeper into making sure this will be sustainable beyond just the communities that are involved with us at the moment. So we're building sort of institutional support. So that was a lesson learnt along the journey, and I think we're in much stronger position now that it means that anybody in Australia can use the youth survey, even if they're not part of the family, and there's nothing to stop them picking on family conflict in their community now. So
yes, this is one of the main challenges in Colombia, because because we have limited resources in the government level and in the community level as well. Then we have realized that without a political will, it's not possible for us. It's very difficult because we have periods of 4 years. Then we have a mayor for years, and he's very excited with this. And then he leaves, and there's another party, and it changes all the time. And then we have to come back and say, okay, but we were doing this in this community. Communities engaged, and they want to do it. And the communities say, we want to do it even if without the support of the government. But anyway, we need resources, and it has been very, very difficult for us. And this is the main barrier and the challenge that we face with the CTC system in Colombia.
Should we go first?
I wait for when you call. Okay. Yes, this question implies that we are able to sustain it, and I'm not quite sure yet at this moment. So we started right 10 years ago. So I think we are still on a journey to sustain it, but maybe I have a little bit of biased focus on this. But we are I'm working on a state governmental organization. I will say that it's a critical and crucial point to have a state governmental support for this. So this is CTC implies so much work on a community level that is difficult to do, and if you're not able to provide support, technical assistance, all these kind of instruments to communities, it's very hard for communities to sustain the work. So there must be an institution on a higher level that is able to provide this kind of support, even if it's not going on in the community for some times that they are able to take over after a crisis. And we have seen that it's much more complicated to sustain CTC on a smaller community. So it's easier to start with CTC in smaller communities because the decision making is not that complicated. There are less stakeholders to convince, and then they start. But this is the limited resources that they have in the smaller communities. That's so hard for them. So this is for us. We go to the next step. So the county administration or the bigger city administration is one of the institutions that we need to convince. Then it's easier to sustain it, but then you have new tensions because CTC then in the bigger areas is one of certain initiatives that are going on. You compete with the other ones, and you have shifting interests from policymakers in this. But I think at this time that it's a crucial point that we cannot load all of this effort on the smaller community level, that we need to involve the higher responsibilities into this. Then it's too hard for the communities to sustain it.
I totally agree with what Frederick says. I would like to add that even though it's really important to have an institution that supports you, a private or governmental, on the other hand, there is a work that we have to do with the communities, so they understand that CTC is a long-term process, and it's really important, like, to handle those extra expectations from the first moment you go to the territory. If the communities don't understand that, they
lose motivation.
Yeah, they lose motivation, and CTC is a system that is based on the community. So they have to understand that we're seeking long-term results, that probably they're not going to observe any changes in 2, 3, 4 years. They're going to observe it in 10 years. So for us, that has been like a very important challenge, to make sure that the communities understand that this is a long-term process, and that they have to commit on long terms.
And was it hard to work with the communities to kind of
It has been, it has been a hard work. One of the main things that has worked is that we have a community coordinator that is part of the community, and they have been making like a one-on-one work, reminding everyone and handling expectations, and on the other hand, also handling expectations of others' institutions. For example, in our case, we reached the point where we had selected the programs to implement, but the community boards didn't have the finance to implement the programs. So we have to handle everyone's expectations, that the community and CTC has their own time, that we cannot rush them. But at the same time, we need the commitment and the understanding that if we want long-term result, we have to be constant, and we have to believe that the long-term results, we're going to reach them. And the other ones are urban communities from middle and low incomes and really small territories. So we have like those two experiences.
We have also a variation. So initially the types of communities that wanted to work with us were those who were probably more regional communities. So they're very clearly defined that they needed to work with their own resources. They couldn't sort of pull in resources from a big city. So they were the ones who started the work with us. And some of those that are the larger ones of about getting to, I guess, around 100,000. So these are the sizes. At that stage, they wanted to break down into smaller units, and that's another thing, the idea of local area groups being important where they were more sizable. Then in more recent time, we've had the phenomena of small communities wanting to work with the model, and we were a little bit doubtful, we weren't sure, but it's ended up quite successful that those small communities where they have the champions have been able to have a lot of cohesiveness, and particularly where there were strong people who were able to sort of pull others together, it's been very useful. And then we've done some cost benefits analysis. I see you there, Margaret. You would have a view on what the size is before all of the effort of all the people is no longer economic. But we've certainly had some questions about this. But it does seem that as long as it's done efficiently with the over the period of time, then it can still be, cost effective. But it would be good to hear your comments on that.
CTC really was developed for use in the United States. You have to balance the need for fidelity to the original model. If you adapt too much, it's not community care anymore, and the flexibility and adaptation to the new context. And how have you approached this difficulty, and do you think that fidelity and flexibility are compatible, and how has that played out for you guys? For you, yes.
I think, we think that the fidelity and adaptation can be combined, and that is much about the checklists I talked about as well. Because it's more like you have a goal, and you have to achieve this goal, and how exactly you do it. It's that's the flexible way you can solve this. You have to build a coalition, that's a goal, and how do you exactly do this? That's up to the people to think of. So
I think that CTC by itself, it's a flexible program, and it also has other instruments that, even though they're not like mandatory from the system, you can use them, and when you are adapting it to, in our case, to a different language, to a different culture, they're really useful. One of them, and it's for the curators, and the other one is for the community board. And even though the CTC system doesn't tell you you must do it, they recommend you when to do it. Please intervene.
No. I just want to clarify for other people. I think you're talking about there are a couple of monitoring tools that we use to to assess how the coalition is functioning. Are they developing and functioning? Are they developing the skills that they need to work effectively and communicate, etc. And then there's also another instrument where we survey key leaders in the community to see how kind of the bigger community is changing or not changing, what attitudes they have, norms towards substance use, or whether they perceive that a community as a whole is kind of adopting more of a science-based approach to prevention. So there are these tools that we use to interview people that work within the coalition also are leaders within community. So just to clarify that that's what
No,
you
totally, yes. So these tools, these monitoring tools, we can know if the adaptations we're making, we're going on the right way. I think those ones are also useful because the systems allows you to make some adaptations. It has some flexibility, but also gives you some tools so you can be looking where you're going on the path. You're going the right path. Review the evidence of some programs that work in our country.
We did the same.
Because we found out that there were some programs that they ran out of funding, so no one was implementing them. That's another strategy, to review the evidence that is already there for two reasons. One, there are some programs that have evidence and no one is implementing them. And on the other hand, there are some programs that say they have evidence, but they don't. So that's another strategy.
to talk about the main tensions that you faced during this work and the main lessons learned from CTC implementation in your country. And do you want to start, Carter?
Okay, because I could talk for hours.
But I'm not
Because
gonna let
there
you
are so
talk
many
for hours.
tensions. So this is of course the tension that yet you have between the evidence movement and the non-evidence movement. But this is too obvious. So I like to raise another point that we have learned over the years, that you can talk about effective prevention, and there's a difference between the ones who talk about and the other ones who try to do it. So that we are in a situation where evidence, outcomes, evaluation, prevention, like this, is a risk to come to a buzzword because everyone uses this and no one is very clear what it is about. And CTC really helps us to make this kind of tension, to say, okay, we can be very concrete, very detailed, or we can say what is an evidence-based program because we have the criteria for this. We can say what are the outcomes that are relevant for the community. We can talk about what are we can assess needs on a more reliable way than just all the professionals sit together and guess what maybe the needs are. And they talk about that this is a need assessment or something like this. So there's a German saying, I think there's no direct equivalent in English that says wash me but don't make me wet. So this is kind of the part of the prevention or effective prevention movement in Germany, that they use all these words but they do not doing the things, and the CTC helps us to be more precise on this, and not only to raise the questions, how do you assess evidence, but also give some answers to this. What are the programs? How do we find out what are on which way they are implemented? You say you are implementing an evidence-based program, and then we look concrete and say, okay, this is one teacher in one school that going to a training and try to doing it in a class, and we say, oh, you don't implementing an evidence-based program in a way that it should be, and CTC really helps us to not only have the right question, but also have some answers on it.
Well, besides what I have already said, mainly the evidence-based program, that it takes time and that it's not easy to make adaptations. There's no one recipe. You have to take time, and as someone said before, you have to do and undo things and do them again and undo them again. So it really takes time. And one of the main tension in our case, that is something that some of you guys have already resolved, is that we have the commitment of the community that we welcome the local governments. So we have just recently one community where we have the commitment of the local government financing one of the local coordinators, but we need to get the involvement of the local government so the system has sustainability over time.